We are excited to have you in class today. My name is Curry Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And this class this week is all about the Second Amendment. So we're going to dive into the Second Amendment, really unpack the words and the commas in the Second Amendment, understand what the debate has been around that over time. But also, this is one of my favorite classes because we get to understand different moments in time and really gauge into what was happening and what the stories are in that period and how it affects our understanding of those words today in these lenses of time. So to do all this, we're with one of our top scholars at the Constitution Center, Tom Donnelly. So Tom, this is really quickly becoming one of my favorite classes because it is so revealing. So we're going to go through a lot and we're going to have a healthy civil dialogue on the Second Amendment. And we're going to ask you a million questions. So are you prepared?
I'm ready.
As always, Tom, we appreciate you and your ability to handle our questions. So students, I can see you doing it already. Put the questions in the chat or the Q&A. I always list a million key questions that we have for class, like why did the founders put it in the Bill of Rights in the first place? But when we think about the big question that's at the heart and almost the heat of the debate over time in our country on the Second Amendment, we think about the question right here. So Tom, can you kind of frame the class for us and help us understand what is at the heart of the debate? And then we'll dive into the actual text of the Second Amendment and read it together.
Absolutely. So, the Second Amendment protects a right to keep and bear arms. And as we know, it's one of these constitutional issues that's alive in our politics. It's alive in debates in law schools. It's alive in debates on the Supreme Court. And it all boils down to this question Curry has on the screen here, which is, when can the government limit the individual right to possess guns and other firearms, and when can't it? And so today we're going to walk through the text. We're going to walk through two key founding stories around the Second Amendment, and then talk a lot about the debates around the Second Amendment on the Supreme Court in recent years and all the way up through today.
Awesome. And Tom, and we talked about this last class, but I think it's really, the intersectionality of this amendment with all the different branches of government, I find super interesting, especially Congress and the courts. But you pointed out last class, it's also federalism. It's not just the national government, it's the state governments too. And then the interplay between the states too, which got us into the Commerce Clause, which is my favorite clause last class. So many layers to this as we dive into the words. And I just wanted to nod to that before we kicked off. So as students engage in the conversation of what does the court say about this? Well, what is Congress's power to limit or not limit? And where does that balance as well in writing laws? So I'll hand over the Second Amendment to you, and I'm going to unhighlight this until we get back to this point towards the end.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on your point there, Curry, it's also the state and local government's powers to regulate firearms in the interests of the health, safety, and welfare of their residents versus what sort of protections we think are in the Constitution to prevent those sorts of laws. So again, you're right. It's like so many different branches of government, so many different layers of government. But it all begins with this famous text, the Second Amendment. And it reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so when lawyers look at this text, what they see two different parts. And a lot of the questions about how to interpret the Second Amendment turn on what the individual interpreter finds to be the relationship between the first part of the Second Amendment and the second part of the Second Amendment. So beginning with the first part, lawyers call this the Preparatory Clause. And again, it reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. And so read in context, this is really meant to express one of the core purposes of the Second Amendment when it was written into the Constitution. And that's saying that a well-regulated militia is, quote, necessary to the security of a free state. So what's going on with that text? Well, it's the founding generation talking about it's speaking to the founding generations. One, their concern about standing armies. So these are professional armies paid for by the government, and a concern that these sorts of armies are often the agents of tyranny. And so it's a broad concern that with this new powerful national government we're creating with the Constitution, that we want to have some protections in place to avoid that national government using a professional army to, in the end, oppress the people. And so it's expressing a broad commitment and broad preference for national security being organized around well-regulated militias. These are militias that are organized by the state and local governments, led by local leaders, and also filled with members from the local community, tying, in the end, the community's protection to those residents' own duty to protect their own community. And so we'll get more into that in a little bit, but that's all packed into that preparatory clause. And then the second clause, in many ways, the more straightforward and the more famous part, really, of the Second Amendment, says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so this text expresses a core right of the people, namely the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And again, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how do we read that first part, the preparatory clause, together with the second part, the operative clause. For some justices and some scholars, they think the preparatory clause limits the overall protection you find in the Second Amendment, really tightly linking it to that core purpose of a well-regulated militia, whereas other justices and other scholars argue that in the end, what's important about the Second Amendment is it's expressing this broad commitment to a right of the people to keep and bear arms, an individual right that we all hold, that some view as a natural right given by God or nature, and that in the end, the preparatory clause is just best read as one purpose among many. And a lot of what we come down to when we interpret the Second Amendment, how we talk about the relationship between those two clauses will tell us how much authority we think the government has to regulate firearms, and sort of conversely, how much bite we think the Second Amendment has to strike down and challenge laws that are passed by governments at all levels.
Ooh, and I love that tension that you just set up there and trying to understand the two together, and how they're at a balance, or what balance we have struck right now. There is one question that there's a couple questions that popped out of that and in our chat and everything, and I want to dive into the colonial period and what were their lived experiences? Why did they put these in here in the first place? Let me actually get the right words. Why did they put this into the Second Amendment? But as we kind of get into that and into these stories, one of the questions is, why doesn't it mean the right to own a slingshot, the right to own a knife? How do you define the word arms? And I've heard professors talk about this before. What does it mean, the right to keep and bear arms, and how did they define it at the time as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's something we'll certainly dig into. Heller itself, the big Supreme Court landmark decision, has something to say about that. I think for a lot of scholars and a lot of justices, what they'll say is that arms in this context, what the Supreme Court has said is that arms in this context speaks to what you would think of as commonly used arms. Arms that, sort of like the proper analogy would be, what sort of arms do people commonly hold and might be used in the context of a citizen-led militia? And so because of that, for the Supreme Court, it would be something like firearms like handguns, which are, relatively commonly used, would be an arm protected for Second Amendment purposes. But one that's sort of unusual and unusually dangerous, like a bazooka, would not fall within that. But again, these are contested terms, and over time, people have debated sort of what should fall within that category and what should not.
Thank you for doing that. Thank you for bringing up bazookas. I appreciate that so much. Now let's get into what was the experience of the colonial people that were so worried about a standing army? I mean, you hear it not just in the context of the Second Amendment, but you hear it in the debates at the Constitutional Convention. And even before that, they are paranoid, and rightfully so, of a standing army. And you talked about it a little bit before, but give us the reason why they were so scared. It's not just because of what could happen, it's what they had happen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of this is growing out of the experience of colonial America leading up to the American Revolution. So one thing to remember is as we're plowing ahead towards the American Revolution, many parts of America are occupied by British troops. And so for the American colonists, as we're moving towards the American Revolution, this feels like having an imperial occupying force in America there to harass the colonists, there to sometimes abuse their liberties. And this is perhaps best seen in colonial Boston, where we have really the most rabble-rousing patriots in America. How does the British Empire respond? By cracking down on them, by closing down their representative assemblies, by sending a ton of troops onto the streets of Boston. By 1775, Boston has 16,000 people. The British stationed 4,000 soldiers there. So 16,000 Bostonians, 4,000 soldiers. That's a ton. That's a massive military presence in Boston. And so this early experience really colors the American colonists, feelings about standing armies, about professional armies. So for them, they sort of have two different images in mind. On the one hand, when you think of a standing army and you're the American colonist, you think of the imperial occupying forces of Great Britain. For someone like a James Madison, who's more scholarly, he may think of all of the examples going back from ancient Greece and Rome all the way through to colonial America about ways in which tyrants use armies to oppress the people. And also, who's in a professional army from the perspective of the founding generation? These are mercenaries. These are paid guns for hire. These are people that are so disconnected with their local communities that they're willing to go work for a national government and really be traveled out and shipped out anywhere. And so that's the image of standing armies they have. And on the other hand, they see something virtuous in the citizen militia. And so for them, they see it connected to a broader vision of civic republican virtue where the ordinary person in their community doesn't really pursue their own self-interest, but promotes the common good, the common interest, the community interest. Part of that is being able to fulfill your duty to protect your community. And so coming out of this colonial experience, on the one hand, the American colonists have a fear of standing armies, and on the other hand, they feel great warmth and see great virtues in the citizen-led militia.
And I find this part so interesting because you're seeing how they understood it in like 1780, 1776, 1778, and then we'll look at this again at the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and it's almost like a flip-flop. And a shift. So we see that over and over again, but I find it even more interesting in this context. So I just wanted to point it out, looking at the standing army as big, scary, bad, oppressing the people, and the citizen militia as protecting the people, protecting the ones in the community and being one with the community. So digging kind of into that. And we hear this idea resonate in the Declaration of Independence and moves to the Constitutional Convention. So what are some of the pieces that they put in this? The Second Amendment's added in 1791, so it's added after the Constitutional Convention. Are there parts of the original Constitution that reference standing armies, that reference the right of the militia?
Yeah, so coming out of the colonial experience, again, there's a fear of standing armies. We see them even before the US Constitution, many of these concerns being written into the state constitutions at the time. So we have in state constitutions, a few of them, a protection for an individual right for self-defense. We have in many of them discussion of militia duty, and in nearly all of them, if not all of them, concerns about standing armies written into those state constitutions. So, and as we get into the Constitutional Convention, that's a background to understand that there's a broad feeling about that and standing armies. But on the other hand, as we're coming out of the American Revolutionary experience, there's also a different set of arguments. And these are from people like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who served in the Continental Army themselves. Their fear was less about the dangers of an oppressive standing army and more concerned about how are we going to ensure American national security going forward. They thought, they looked at it and they said, we almost lost the American Revolution. We didn't give the national government that existed before the US Constitution under the Articles of Confederation enough power to tax and spend for the general welfare, to raise an army and a navy. And so there's this sense going into the Constitutional Convention that part of what we want to do with this new US Constitution, at least this is among the reformers, the Federalists, those who support this new Constitution, is to give the national government more power to shape national security for America. And so if we're looking at the provisions of the original Constitution, there's nothing in there specifically about concerns about standing armies, but there are key provisions that give this new national government the ability to tax, the ability to establish a peacetime standing army. So now there's power in the national government to do that, and also to regulate the militia. So there's a great shift of power in this proposed constitution towards the national government and towards greater power to create a professional army. And so you can imagine, immediately, there's so many people growing out of the American colonial experience who look at that with alarm. And so when we look at the anti-federalists, those who oppose this new constitution, so many of them opposed it on the grounds that this new national government has too much power to create a standing army and is taking power away from the states and the militia. So we see this at the Constitutional Convention. There's 3 dissenters at the end of the convention, Edmund Randolph, Elbridge Gerry, and George Mason, who refused to sign the new constitution. And part of their objections are that there are no protections against a standing army. And then we see these arguments furthermore developed by other key anti-federalist voices during the battle over ratification of the new Constitution. You look at someone like Brutus, who was one of the leading anti-federalists, thought to be New York's Robert Yates. What does he argue? He argues this new national government is going to consolidate all power in the national government. There's going to be a, quote, destruction of our liberty. How? In part by the creation of a new standing army. So the anti-federalists are really advancing these arguments arising out of the colonial experience and trying to say this new national constitution is scary. It's doing too much to create a military establishment in America. On the flip side, though, then we see the Federalists, those who support the Constitution, come out and defend it. Part of it, one of those strongest defenders of the new national Constitution is Alexander Hamilton. And so what Hamilton says, Hamilton's a very strong supporter of a strong national government and a strong military. And effectively what he says to the anti-federalists is, you're right, the British were lousy to us. There's a lesson in that. There are dangers to standing armies, but please grow up. We are going to be a great nation. The way we ensure that we can become a great nation is that the first thing we have to do is take care of national security. The Europeans want to dominate us. We have to protect ourselves and ensure that we remain independent. Part of what we have to do is make sure this new national government has the power to defend us. And then James Madison comes in and he tries to find a compromise position, effectively saying, on the one hand, yes, national governments often do have this power to create professional armies. That can be useful sometimes, but he also honored the American experience. And he really honored the virtues of citizen-led militia and said that, for the purposes of American security, a lot can be done through citizen-led militias to keep us safe. And so as we're moving towards the creation of the Second Amendment, framed in large part by James Madison, what we get from the Second Amendment is a bit of a compromise. On the one hand, the Second Amendment doesn't take away many of these new powers of the national government to create a standing army. But what it does do is it responds to the anti-federalist fears that the national government might simply disarm the people and get rid of the militia. And so it's giving some additional protections for the militia to be organized and armed and ensure the national government will not have the power to disarm those militias.
Fantastic. And I still always laugh every time you say Hamilton tells everybody to grow up, because he literally does. He's just like, okay, get out of your colloquial thinking, let's be big boys here. And the urgency that they're knocking down our doors, literally surrounding us, Britain and Spain and stuff like that. This is a real fear that if they don't get it together, they won't be able to defend this new nation. Now, one of the things, and I highlighted it in Article 1, Section 8, and two people asked about already in the Q&A, is about suppress insurrections. So there's been lots of conversations, and I can tell that a lot of people have read this about, having a military isn't just about Britain, isn't just about keeping Spain at bay, Portugal, whoever. It's about also ensuring that insurrections in our own country don't happen. And we're talking about this, they're talking about slave insurrections and slave revolts fighting for their freedom. So could you unpack that a little for us too?
Sure. So if you're looking from the founders' perspective, insurrections, it could mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that for some of the founders, part of the Constitution, part of the reason the Constitution is so important is to suppress the danger of mob violence as well. And so for the founding generation, part of what they're concerned about are things like Shays' Rebellion, where we had an uprising of farmers in Western Massachusetts threatening the authority of the state government and ultimately of the national government. And so there's a sense that we want the national government and militias to have enough power to project force to put down threats of mob violence like that. But there's certainly an active scholarly debate about how much the institution of slavery affected the framing of the militia clauses and also of the Second Amendment, with certain Southern voices being concerned with this new government, that the new national government is going to have a ton of power over the militia, that they're largely the North has the greater population and so is going to have more control over the national government. So therefore wanting some protections in the Second Amendment for making sure that militias are armed in such a way to protect white Southerners from the potential of enslaved people having an insurrection. And so there's sort of an active scholarly debate about how to balance which of these factors were most important, but it's certainly a live debate and one to keep track of and read about.
Awesome. And then one more question before we jump into almost the same analysis, but in the time period after the Civil War. What's the difference between, what is a militia? Let's just define that, because I think it's a very loosely used term and word. And sometimes people just mean to say army or military group. And sometimes people just think it's like a club that they're all hanging out. So what is a militia?
Yeah, so when we're talking about a militia in this context, we're not just talking about like a private group of individuals getting together. We're talking about a formal institutional body organized by state and local governments to protect the state and the local community. And so this is, it's going to be it's going to be broadly representative of people from that local community might serve in the militia. They might have to get together every now and again and muster on the town green would be like the classical thing to think about. They'd have to keep their own firearms and things like that. But it's sort of a body, though, that's organized by the state and local governments and meant to protect the community. And the key counterpoint, and this is the citizen militia are supposed to be just like ordinary people from the community. These are not professional soldiers. And so that's to be contrasted with a standing army, which is a professional army, that's funded in many cases by the national government, that's always there. These are professional soldiers. That's their job, is to serve in the military. And so that's the difference between the two. The concern being, again, that at least in the founding period, standing armies were seen to often include ruffians who they individually would be more likely to abuse people's rights, but also more broadly, because they are under the employ of the national government, would then take commands from the national government, often to suppress the people, their liberties, and especially dissenters.
One more clarifying question. What's the difference between a militia and the National Guard? Sorry.
Yes, so the National Guard, that's an interesting question. So if the National Guard is, as we know it today, was created in sort of the early part of the 20th century, and in part is in a response to some critics of the performance of volunteer companies during the Spanish-American War, and also complaints about state and local militias basically not being well organized enough or available enough for the national government to keep America safe. And so the National Guard ends up emerging as this body that is, that ends up so it's between 1903 and 1933, you end up seeing a fusion of what was originally the state and local militia and the national government into a body that's effectively funded. It has some leadership from, the state, but it's funded by the national government. Training is done by the national government. And so it's a way in which what was originally a more sort of like something where there's a lot of state and local control over militias being organized into this body that's a fusion of sort of national and state and local power that's lodged in each state. And members of the National Guard today, I believe, are both members of their state guard and the National Guard. So it's the way in which we do it's somewhere in between sort of this citizen-led militia of the founding and the standing army or professional army of today. I'm sorry, that was not the clearest, but that's sort of the best I can do. Effectively, what happens over time is that we have these state and local militias. The national government's not thrilled about how they're performing. And so the national government uses both their powers under the Constitution to regulate the militia and the spending power to reshape state and local militias in a way that's more useful to the national government to provide for national defense and create sort of more professionalized and uniform bodies across the states.
Got it. It reminded of when I tried to explain what's the difference between a state and a commonwealth. It's like 8 hours later, I get to my area, but that was helpful, Tom. That totally made sense. Okay, now flash forward, 1865 time period. We have got the Civil War. We start to end the Civil War. There's a shift now in how we understand those two things that we were just talking about. The national military or America's standing army and state militias after the Civil War ends, and thinking about how when the local government isn't there to protect the rights of individuals, how does it shift the way people use and understand the Second Amendment?
Yeah, so coming out of the Civil War, at least for many Americans, there's a transformation in how they think about professional armies and standing armies. The sense that it was the Union Army that ultimately won the Civil War. And for many Americans, especially African Americans, the sense that it was actually the National Army itself that's there not to abuse rights, but ultimately to protect them. Furthermore, what we see is a transformation, or at least a new tradition grow up around the idea of firearms, especially in the African American community, being important not just to like the protection of state and local governments, but also to the individual. That, in a post-Civil War America, if you're an African American in the South, you can't rely on your state and local governments. And therefore, the individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense is important to protect yourself, your family, your neighbors, your community. In the end, it's sort of a story of self-reliance. And so individual right to keep and bear arms becomes important in that sense. And what we see coming out of the Civil War are a range of voices then calling for greater national action to protect an individual right to keep and bear arms for African Americans. In part, this is a response to that wave of Black codes passed by that first wave of Southern governments after the Civil War. These are laws passed by a variety of states to basically try to put African Americans in as much of a condition like slavery as possible, even after emancipation. And part of what those laws do is that they disarm African Americans. They take away their firearms. Who do they target first? They target former Union soldiers who have moved back down south again. And so we have a range of voices calling for action. Frederick Douglass saying the only way that we're going to see a protection of all rights, including the individual right to keep and bear arms, is through national action. We see the organization of African American conventions throughout the nation, where these are meetings of African Americans explaining what America needs to do to ensure a new birth of freedom for African Americans and equal citizenship. Part of what they say is that the individual right to keep and bear arms is very important. We see the Reconstruction Republicans, so the people who are in power after the Civil War, passing landmark statutes that are there in part to protect African Americans' right to keep and bear arms, things like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is the first major civil rights bill in American history, the Freedmen's Bureau Act, and even we see some of these debates around the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868. But finally, in many ways, the best quote I can think of that encapsulates this alternative vision or this additional vision of the Second Amendment is from Ida B. Wells in 1892. So it's a few decades after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. We're just at the beginning of sort of the expansion of Jim Crow laws throughout the South. And Ida B. Wells explains a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home. When the white man knows he runs as great a risk of biting the dust every time his African-American victim does, he will have a greater respect for African-American life.
And this is like such a powerful statement. And if you don't know Ida B. Wells, she is one to read and is a huge crusader for African-American rights, but also an anti-lynching crusader. So the reason I bring that up is because we're talking about mass murderings of African Americans, former soldiers, and we see this over time. And it's not just the South, it's the North as well. And that kind of leads to this conversation around Second Amendment and the violence towards African Americans, and then looking at how the court rules on this and how it rules around Second Amendment connections and cases. So, Tom, I know we have like 4 cases to go through pretty quickly, but do you want to talk about the Colfax Massacre and Crookshank really quickly? And that'll bounce us to Heller, McDonald, and then the rifle case.
No problem. So
Cool.
Yes. Okay, let's start with Crookshank. So this is a case in 1876. It grows out of the Colfax Massacre of April 1873. The thing to know about this is one of the most massive acts of violence against African Americans after the Civil War. Ultimately, what happens is there's a battle in Louisiana over the election of 1872. Both parties said that they won. And so it's a battle between Democrats and Republicans to take over the courthouse in Colfax. The Republicans, including African-American Republicans, take control of the courthouse. They're there with arms to protect themselves. Ultimately, a white mob comes, it burns down the courthouse. African-Americans flee from the courthouse, and over 100 African-Americans are killed as they fled. The Grant administration prosecutes the leaders of this massacre, including William Crookshank. They actually win convictions, which is really hard to do during this period. And ultimately, the Supreme Court throws out these convictions. And for purposes of the Second Amendment, what it does is it says, one, Congress didn't have power to pass the law that was used in this case because in the end, Congress doesn't have the power to attack actions by private individuals, only laws passed by state and local governments. And the other thing is it reads the Second Amendment very narrowly, saying that the Second Amendment only applies to the national government. It doesn't apply to the states. But Curry, it does call to mind that one of the interesting features of the Second Amendment from a constitutional law perspective, case law perspective, is the Supreme Court decides very few Second Amendment cases. And there really isn't a major landmark Supreme Court case on the Second Amendment until District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008. So that's 1791 to 2008.
Yeah, and there's the question that we're going to see in this, and we don't have to vote now, but can a city effectively ban handguns within a city limit? So it brings us back to the questions earlier about like, what are arms? and what are the limits that cities, states, and the federal government can put on arms that people can have, and defining what is an arm too was really helpful in the beginning. So I'll ping that over back to you with Heller.
Yeah, so Heller, this case involves a Second Amendment challenge to a Washington, D.C. law, which effectively banned handguns in the city. It was one of the most restrictive gun regulations in the country. And so what the Supreme Court has to do is they have to do what we did at the beginning of this class. And that's look at the Second Amendment's text and say, does the Second Amendment allow a challenger to strike down a law like this, a law that has really nothing to do with militia service, but is a regulation on the individual right to keep and bear arms? And so the Supreme Court had to decide that. And in a 5-4 decision, it endorsed an individual rights view of the Second Amendment, effectively saying that the Second Amendment's text protects a broad right to keep and bear arms. And that prefatory clause that talks about militia, it's there to just state one purpose among many for why we're enshrining that right in the Second Amendment. And so ultimately what the Supreme Court does is it strikes down the DC law. It declares that law unconstitutional. What Justice Scalia does here is he says the text of the Second Amendment itself, the words used, keep and bear arms, sure, it works in the militia context, but it also applies to the individual right to keep and bear arms. Two, that prefatory clause about militias that doesn't really restrict the broad right to keep and bear arms, and so that the Second Amendment is best read as protecting effectively a broad individual right to keep and bear arms. And three, if we look at the state constitutions at the time of the founding, many of them protected an individual right to keep and bear arms. So that was a broadly and widely known understanding of what right would be associated with firearms in this context. And so what Justice Scalia is doing here, in the end, the decision strikes down the DC handgun law, and it sets at least a first principle for interpreting the Second Amendment over time. And what it's saying is the Second Amendment is best read as an individual right to keep and bear arms, especially for purposes of protecting one's home. And so that's Justice Scalia. But we see, on the other hand, a strong opinion in dissent by Justice John Paul Stevens. And what's interesting is both justices use originalism to argue their case, really good, digging deep into the Constitution's text and history around the Second Amendment. And Justice John Paul Stevens basically just says, Justice Scalia, you're reading the Second Amendment wrong. The prefatory clause about the militia tells us what this amendment's about. And so the protections in the Second Amendment really are just related to militia service, and so shouldn't restrict a state and local, government in this context. And two, when the framers were putting together the Second Amendment, James Madison had a ton of different options on the table. He had state constitutions that talked very specifically about an individual right to keep and bear arms. He had proposals from state ratifying conventions that did the same thing. But ultimately, what he chose was an amendment that placed the right to keep and bear arms in the context of militia service. And so ultimately, what John Paul Stevens is doing is interpreting the Second Amendment in a way where the right is much narrower, and it gives governments much more authority to shape firearms regulations over time, really taking the question largely out of the hands of the courts often and placing it in the hands of Congress and in state and local governments.
Awesome. So, and again, bringing in like the fact that Congress is there, it's saying there are still limits on gun ownership and guns. This is where they're saying, but here, well, in this case, they're saying, here's the bar. Here's where that limit went too far. And that brings us then to McDonald and kind of explaining those even more.
Yeah, so McDonald asked the natural follow-up question. So the Second Amendment, when ratified, only applied to the national government. The question in McDonald was, okay, so Heller talks about a DC law. Washington, D.C. is a federal territory. It falls under the Second Amendment. Are we now going to apply the Second Amendment's protections to laws passed by state and local governments? For lawyers, this is called the process of incorporation, using the 14th Amendment to apply Bill of Rights protections like the Second Amendment against the states. And what the court says in McDonald, in again, a 5-4 decision, is yes. The Second Amendment, just like the First Amendment, just like the Fourth Amendment, is applied against state and local governments. And so what the court does is strike down a similar handgun ban in the city of Chicago. And so if you're taking Heller and McDonald together, what you would say that they really do is that it's a first attempt by the court to establish a core principle for applying the Second Amendment, and that's the Second Amendment protecting an individual right to gun possession for purposes of protecting one's home. The court is also out there selecting two gun laws that it thinks are among the most restrictive in the country. So in that sense, saying there's at least this line here where these particular laws go too far. But on the other hand, Justice Scalia's majority opinion in Heller also reminds us that the Second Amendment, just like every other amendment, those rights protected there are not absolute. And so what Justice Scalia says in his majority opinion in Heller is, yes, the Washington, D.C. law has to go, but he also acknowledges, quote, longstanding prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of firearms. Then he also acknowledges the, quote, historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. So it's a reminder that moving forward, what the courts are going to have to do is take Heller and McDonald, or the Supreme Court is going to have to take Heller and McDonald, those principles there, some of these caveats Justice Scalia has in this opinion, and figure out how to apply the Second Amendment going forward. The big case on the docket this term, if you're curious, if you're excited about these sorts of questions, there's a big Second Amendment case that the court's going to decide by the end of June called New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. And effectively what it's asking is whether or not what the court said in Heller and McDonald about guns in the home can effectively apply outside the home. And so it's asking a question of, it's a challenge to a New York law that is a permitting regime that makes it relatively difficult to get a permit to carry a concealed weapon outside the home. And the question is, what does the Second Amendment have to say about that?
Perfect. Thank you. Because Colin asked a question, like there were so few cases, and you talked about this earlier in class, there has been so few cases, but this is also like a moment in time where we're seeing a case come down, but the case law is being defined and the limits and the boundaries are being clarified. I think you said it earlier, we're like in the moment that free speech was in World War I and II, we're in that moment now around Second Amendment, but could you kind of explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, so Heller and McDonald are really they're landmark cases that are setting down a broad principle and like really very specific limits on very restrictive laws. But what the court has to do over time is it's just going to have to over time it's going to take more and more challenges to different sorts of laws, things like these sorts of concealed carry laws and other things passed whether by Congress, but especially by state and local governments, and figure out where is the Second Amendment going to really have bite and where are we going to strike down these laws? Where are we going to give governments more authority to regulate? Which reasons that the government can give are we going to find compelling enough to allow for the regulation of firearms in the face of the individual right protected in the Second Amendment? And these sorts of questions in the context of something like the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment, where we have a ton of rules and a ton of case law, took a lot of work by the court over a period of time to come up with these rules. And we're going to end up seeing the same thing in the Second Amendment context.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. I think we've wrapped up most of our questions around this and really kind of watching the courts and what's happening around that. One more question and then I will completely wrap it up. But what did you do? Oh, no, that was it. That was the same question. So we're good. I have one final question, but I want to wrap it up and make sure our students can jump if they want. So thank you so much, Tom, for walking us through all these. I will ask you my final question towards the end, but students, if you have to jump, thank you so much for being with us today.